Chapter 13 is on basic nutrition and includes our fuel for exercise. So it would be an understatement to say that human nutrition is difficult to study. So there's been many nutritional studies that are epidemiological and observational in nature. And the problems with these types of studies were raised back in our discussion in Chapter 6 on critical thinking. So numerous studies ask subjects to remember what they ate, and there's very strong evidence that shows humans aren't really good at recalling their diets accurately. And then other studies might just focus on one food and the effects that it might have on one particular disease. But this ignores other foods as well as our lifestyle patterns that all have the potential to affect aspects of our health. So let's introduce the topic. Although this text cannot discuss diet in detail, it is essential that fitness professionals do study nutrition. It is clear not only exercise habits affect a client's health, but also diet, stress levels, and sleeping patterns all have a major influence as well. And finally, we need to understand the basics of nutrition to be able to educate our clients about healthy eating. So the take-home message is you need to understand the basics, the key principles, the fundamentals. So hopefully that kind of reminds you of what we're doing with exercise science and how you're learning to prescribe exercise programs. If you stick to the basics, the fundamentals, then you're definitely on track. Now let's talk about the scope of practice for a fitness professional. Can a fitness professional give advice to clients about healthy eatings? Often happens is what we have here in our first point, is that many fitness professionals don't learn about nutrition because they mistakenly believe that they're not legally allowed to give nutritional advice. In most jurisdictions, that is incorrect. You are allowed to provide advice as to what constitutes a healthy diet for most individuals. So again, we're referring to the general population. Competent nutritional coaching is often missing in health and fitness training. So oftentimes that might be something that you want to add to your services, as long as, again, it's general advice for healthy diets. You cannot prescribe diets to treat disease, but again, can give recommendations about a general healthy diet. Why is nutritional advice varied and contradictory? So if I was able to ask you, if we were in person, for example, if you could give me feedback about some contradictory advice that you've heard or that you've read about nutrition, I would bet that almost every one of you can think of an example. And so why is this? Well, one reason is food is complex. We don't know about the thousands of different compounds that occur in natural foods. And even one type of food grown in different areas will have slightly different chemical properties. So for example, corn that's grown in Chilliwack versus eastern United States versus in Europe, the corn's going to be slightly different because of different soil and different weather conditions while it's being grown. Another reason the interaction between food and physiology is complex. So the way that food and human physiology interacts is very complicated, and it affects not only the number of calories available, but also your hormonal balance and ultimately how your phenotype is expressed. Exercise also affects the food physiology interaction. So because exercise burns the available energy, remember we learned about this in chapter 11, and affects your hormonal status, how you exercise or whether you exercise is a major factor in the way your body responds to food intake. Now, many of those epidemiological studies that I referred to before, they've been conducted on sedentary populations. Now that's important. So wouldn't you think that if you're doing a study on sedentary people or sedentary physiology, that's going to be different than how somebody who's highly trained reacts to food. And if you think that way, you're correct. So it's uncertain whether these results from the studies on sedentary populations, whether we can apply them to active or highly trained populations. In addition, if we're looking at somebody who's doing primarily strength training, they may require different nutrition than an endurance athlete. The way that food is grown or reared is vastly different. And that was what I was alluding to before in terms of where our corn is grown, for example, but also with animals. So the World Health Organization has classified processed meats, ham, salami, sausages, and hot dogs as a group 1 carcinogen. So there's a strong evidence that processed meats can cause cancer. And red meat, such as beef, lamb, and pork, has been classified as probable cause of cancer. However, if the meat is from a grass-fed, antibiotic-free, growth hormone-free animal, the same as meat from a grain-fed animal that has been given antibiotics or growth hormones. So we can't classify those two different groups of meat sources the same. Our grass-fed and hormone-free and antibiotic-free is not going to be the same as our grain-fed given antibiotics and growth hormones. Nutritional information is contradictory. There's lots of contradictory statements from nutritional experts. For example, we just mentioned about the red meat intake or processed meats can have an increased rate of cancer. But beef from grass-fed cows and whole milk and eggs and other dairy derivatives are a good source of conjugated linoleic acids. And conjugated linoleic acids are our only natural fatty acids accepted by the American National Academy of Sciences that have anti-tumor properties. So again, contradictory information there from two different groups of experts. Dose-response relationships are poorly understood. Like we mentioned above, processed red meat classified as group 1 carcinogen, but that doesn't mean that any amount of red meat, processed red meat, causes cancer. So small amounts of foods that are considered bad, like processed red meats, may be acceptable, whereas large amounts would be potentially causing health effects. Even foods that are essential for life are dangerous in large quantities. And same thing with exercise. If we exercise too little, then that can have negative health effects. But if we exercise too much, that can be damaging as well. And a lot of advice is contrary to evolutionary logic. So by this, we mean that we've evolved eating some foods we've been told are not ideal choices in a healthy diet. And this information tends to swing back and forth. Eggs have been said to be unacceptable in some decades, and then currently eggs are acceptable to eat. Similarly, we did not evolve eating many of the foods that we are now told are okay to eat, like wheat. So given that evolution is one of the few things in biological science that all scientists agree on, meaning it is logical, it seems strange that some of the nutritional advice that's out there would be contrary to this logic. Some further information, why is nutritional advice varied and contradictory? So ancestry and genetic adaptations will affect an individual's response to food. So some human populations have adapted to foods only available since the beginning of agriculture, which was around 11,000 years ago. And other groups have not adapted to this food because the food sources commonly available to their ancestors were different. So this reinforces that prescribing one diet for all humans is not likely to be logical or scientifically justified. Some long-held beliefs are wrong. So some mainstream nutritional beliefs are based on poor research that was done decades ago, and yet these strong beliefs are hard to dispel or get out of the public knowledge. Some research has been conducted incorrectly. So some nutritional research set out to prove what we already knew, and that's not the way that objective scientific research is supposed to be conducted. Think of it as like our confirmation bias. There are too many rules for the general public to digest. So nutritionists and dietitians want to be very thorough in their analyses, but sometimes they provide too many rules, give too many instructions, and that can just confuse our general population client. And nutritional guidelines are not objective. So a lot of food manufacturers are involved in the development of government-sponsored nutritional guidelines, and we'll highlight that, government guidelines. So many government guidelines are not scientifically objective, nor are they individualized. And then lastly, manufacturers make unreliable claims. So advertisements from food manufacturers often state that their nutritional claims are based on scientific studies, but people don't go and research and look at those studies. So some of these claims are false or unreliable. So the population is led to believe the claims are true, and that's not always the case. So how do we evaluate claims suggesting a single optimal diet? For example, you must eat keto, or you must eat low carb, or you must eat a paleo diet. And a paleo diet is a diet similar to what humans ate in Paleolithic times, which was prior to the advent of the agricultural age. A strict paleo diet does not include any grains or dairy products. And that's a potential fallacy of an appeal to evolution. We have evolved to be able to eat dairy and grain products, and the evidence is pretty clear that humans have adapted to what we call Neolithic foods, and any claim that the human genome has not evolved since the advent of agricultural 11,000 years ago is false. We don't really know what our ancestors ate. Plus, foods grown now are likely vastly different given industrialization, and in some cases with genetically modified foods being grown. It might seem logical, but is not based on science. Each decade, there seems to be a new diet trend out there. Keto diet seems to be the current one. Low carb has stuck around. And in the 90s, it was low fat. Now, interesting thing with the low fat diet, in order to keep the food tasting good when it was low fat, they replaced the fat with a lot of simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, and that ended up being worse than the natural fat. Instead, let's rely on scientific consensus. Foods like processed meats, high fructose corn syrup, and trans fats appear to be particularly problematic. So we won't say that's bad, we'll say that's not ideal. Let's imagine a diet that removed or drastically reduced those categories. If we remove our processed meats, our high fructose corn syrup, and trans fats, then we're well on our way to eating a healthy, balanced diet. High fructose corn syrup was made commercially profitable in the 1960s, so that's certainly too short of a time for us to have genetically adapted to such a new food. We can't have adapted to this chemical, and it is added to many packaged and processed foods. So we want to look out for it when we're reading nutrition labels. In this picture, this is taken from a website, currentweek.com, and it shows things that certainly taste good but aren't ideal in our diet. So we've got our processed food, and in order or during the processing, quite often it removes nutrients and vitamins and fibers that are naturally present in the foods, and then it adds back in salts and phosphates. We've got our soft drink consumption. If it's too high, or any soft drink consumption that's high in simple sugars, our processed foods are highly addictive. Your body is going to crave them, so we want to stay away from these most of the time. Our dried fruits, red wine, they contain sulfates, which can cause different health effects. And our foods with high glycemic index break down very quickly, and that can lead to high levels of insulin and diabetes. We'll get into the science of how food affects blood sugar a little bit later. So our key term here is that it's processed. If you're eating something that's been pressed into a funny shape, it's probably something you shouldn't be eating. We want high natural, whole, unprocessed foods. And if we're consuming those foods, whole, natural, unprocessed, then we're doing pretty good with our diet. Traditional diets were or are low in processed foods. So what well-conducted research suggests is that you should eat little to no processed foods. And this is diet advice that you can give to a client. It really is as simple as that. Reports and data from countless missionaries, doctors, researchers, and explorers who have studied the diets of native populations support this view. And there is the information from your text with Weston Price, and he was looking at 14 different subgroups from different Irish and Swiss villages and Arctic and the Africa continent. And every member, or almost every member of the group, enjoyed great health, free of chronic diseases that we see commonly today, no dental decay, no instances of mental illness. They were strong and attractive, and the females bore children that were healthy. And so with the Polynesians, he found they had a diet of tubers, fruits, vegetables, fish, and coconuts. And they had a lot of fatty fish and fatty coconut, so it was a high-fat diet. Now, as I go through this, don't worry about this. You're not going to be quizzed on this. And he looked at the Inuit and their traditional diet, which is also high in fat because they mostly consumed animals and some berries and moss. They ate no cereals, sugar, or added salt. And so they both groups had good health. But when the Polynesians migrated to New Zealand and adopted a Western diet, all of a sudden their rates of diabetes and other chronic degenerative diseases increased dramatically, even though the Western diet was lower in fat than their traditional diet. And then in the Okinawa Islands, their diet was mostly vegetables and rice with some fish and a bit of meat. So their diet was high in carbohydrates and low in fat, and yet they also enjoyed good health. So common theme with these traditional diets, whether high or low in fat, all were low in processed foods. And again, that's our general advice that we can give to every client. We want to eat a variety of natural foods, lots of different colors, avoid processed foods whenever possible. Next, we're going to talk about glycemic index and glycemic load. Now, many nutritionists prefer to know the glycemic load of food, as this takes into account the amount of food that is being consumed. The glycemic index doesn't take into account the amount of food that you eat. So if you eat one rice cake or 20 rice cakes, the glycemic index is the same. So therefore, the argument is that the glycemic load gives better information on the effect of typical servings of foods on your blood sugar. So you need to know by looking, or what you need to know by looking at the glycemic load is how quickly the food delivers glucose to the bloodstream. But you also need to know how much glucose overall will it deliver. And that's why it's argued the glycemic load gives a better understanding of how a food affects blood sugar. So glycemic load is determined by multiplying the grams of carbohydrates in a serving by its glycemic index value and then dividing by 100. We're going to move on to talking about fuel for exercise. And there are three major macronutrients, our proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Although the exact combination of foods ideal for a human is not known, and it's going to vary between individuals, we do know a lot about the role food plays as a fuel for exercise. So the remainder of this chapter, we're going to discuss fuel and fluid in relation to exercise. So our proteins produce 4 kcals per gram. Our carbohydrates also produce 4 kcals per gram. And our fats produce 9 kilocalories per gram. And although it is not considered a major macronutrient, 1 gram of alcohol can be metabolized to liberate 7 kcals. So I'm not suggesting you substitute one of your other macronutrients for alcohol and use it as a fuel. I think you can guess that that's not going to have a very good result on any athletic performance. So we'll talk about carbohydrates first. So carbohydrates and fats are the major fuels used during exercise, and we'll discuss the use of protein as a fuel later on. However, under normal circumstances, our muscles have 4 major sources of energy. We have our plasma, or blood glucose, or sometimes called blood sugar. We have our muscle glycogen, our intramuscular triglycerides, and our plasma fatty acids. So if you think back to chapter 11, we actually did talk about these fuel sources or sources of energy. We talked about glucose and glycogen and training glycolysis. And we talked about intramuscular triglycerides getting broken down and entering the Krebs cycle to help with fat metabolism during our aerobic or oxidative metabolism. And same thing with our plasma fatty acids. You'll probably remember that from chapter 11. Now let's look at blood glucose. It is the goal of our body to maintain blood glucose. So you've probably had an episode where your blood glucose gets low and you didn't feel very good. You felt tired, weak, jittery. You might describe yourself as hangry. And it's at this point that you're hypoglycemic. Remember, your glucose is the brain's major source of fuel. Blood glucose is regulated by hormones, insulin and glucagon, and those are produced in the pancreas. After a meal, blood glucose is higher, and the liver removes the excess glucose from the blood to store it as glycogen. Well, blood glucose levels can fluctuate throughout the day, so it's usually in relation to timing and the composition of our meals and our snacks, but also it can relate to our exercise routines. If glycogen stores are full, this excess blood sugar will be stored as fat in adipose tissue. So if we happen to overdo it at the buffet with our carbohydrate consumption, then any excess blood sugar is going to be stored as fat in our adipose tissue. If you're exercising regularly and at a fairly high intensity, again, think about our glycolysis, then we'll be using a lot of that stored glycogen as fuel. If blood glucose decreases, such as between our meals and during exercise, then the liver releases the stored glycogen to be broken down to glucose. Especially if we didn't eat much and we had a really hard workout, the liver is going to release that stored glycogen to fuel our muscles. And remember, we have about 2,000 calories stored carbohydrate and glucose and glycogen at any one point in time. And even lactate produced during exercise can be converted to glucose for fuel during exercise. So remember, we also mentioned that in chapter 11, that with our anaerobic activities, lactate is produced and the liver can convert it back into glucose, and that can be used as fuel. Muscle glycogen. The use of glycogen during exercise by a specific muscle and by muscle fibers, which are muscle cells within that muscle, depends on the following. Exercise intensity. So if we get closer and closer to our VO2 max, or exercising closer to our threshold, we're going to be using more glycogen. So if we're walking slowly, you're not going to be using much glycogen. However, if we increase the speed and higher until we're exercising near our VO2 max, then you're going to be using more glycogen. Muscles involved in the exercise, glycogen will be depleted in the muscles used. So let's imagine we're running stairs and you're going to run 400 stairs in 3 minutes. So that's a pretty long, intense bout of work or exercise. And what muscles are you going to be using? Well, of course, you're going to be using your leg muscles. So that's going to include your calf, your gastroc and soleus, your quads, hamstrings, and glutes are all going to be used. So the glycogen is going to get depleted from those muscles. The type of muscle or motor unit recruited. So our type 2 fibers tend to like to use glycogen or glucose preferentially for fuel. And then lastly, our body can make glucose from protein when glycogen levels are too low from low carbohydrate diets. So if we're on a low carbohydrate diet, i.e. our carbs make up less than 30% of our total dietary intake, we can make glucose from protein. It's not easy for the body to do, but it can be done. On this slide, it's looking at glycogen usage during level and uphill running. And you can see the diagram is pointing to several different muscle groups. Our vastus lateralis, which is our lateral quadriceps muscles, our gastrocnemius, which is our larger calf muscle, more superficial, and then our soleus, which is deeper and a bit more distal in the posterior lower leg. So all of those muscles are involved in this exercise, running on level surface versus running uphill. And it looks at our differences in glycogen usage between those different running conditions. So for example, during uphill running, our quadriceps are going to be recruited a lot more than they would be during level running. And this is shown by increased usage of glycogen by the vastus lateralis during our uphill running. If we were to compare my glycogen usage between the Boston Marathon, which had a net downhill, compared to the Diaz Vistas trail race that I did a little over a week ago that had 6,000 feet of elevation change, obviously that's going to change how the muscles are recruited and the glycogen usage as well. So for example, during the Diaz Vistas, I had cramping in my adductor or groin muscles, and I have never experienced cramping in those muscles before. So I was clearly exhausting my glycogen stores in those muscles, and it speaks to the different terrain and how I was using the muscles differently to stabilize my hips and my knees and my pelvis because of the uneven, rocky, and rooty terrain. So as I depleted those glycogen stores, the muscles started to cramp. Figure 13.2 shows muscle glycogen content decreasing on our y-axis here over a certain distance run on the x-axis. And what you'll see, if I'm going for a long distance run, up to 30 kilometers, I'm going to be preferentially recruiting my slow twitch fibers. So we'll see a greater amount of muscle glycogen depletion from those slow twitch fibers. And that's because of the distance that's being run, it can't be high intensity. So for a given muscle, such as our vastus lateralis that we're looking at here, there'll be much greater depletion of glycogen in our slow twitch fibers than in our fast twitch fibers after endurance run. So the main take home is that this is long duration. In figure 13.3, this is different. It's showing muscle glycogen content during a repeat sprint workout. And the muscle glycogen content of fast and slow twitch fibers in the vastus lateralis muscle during repeated sprint bouts on a stationary bike. So at the bottom, it's showing the number of sprinting bouts up to 6. So that's considered to be high intensity intervals. In repeat sprint workout or high intensity interval training, obviously our fast twitch fibers will be preferentially recruited, and they'll show greater glycogen depletion than our slow twitch fibers will. So this would be a good test question between figure 13.2 and figure 13.3 is what type of work or what intensity would deplete glycogen in a fast twitch fiber, and then what type of work, what type of intensity would deplete glycogen in a slow twitch fiber. So it's important to note the differences between those two slides. And then lastly, for the first half of chapter 13, we'll look at blood glucose a bit more. And glucose supplied to muscle cells from blood glucose or muscle glycogen also has a role in protein sparing. We need glucose in our muscles because that is where glycolysis takes place. So we get the glucose from our blood or our muscle or our liver. Then when we do that, it spares the protein. Now I mentioned earlier, if you're on a low carb diet, that you can use protein and you'll break it down into glucose, but it's not ideal because where are we getting the protein from? Yes, some of it is from the food that we eat if it contains protein, but some of it is also from our own muscle mass. So it's not ideal for low carb diets to be followed by very active individuals. If you do not have enough glycogen for muscular contraction, the muscle can convert amino acids into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. And that's just what I was talking about, and now we have a term for it. It's gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the generation of glucose from non-carbohydrates, such as lactate, glycerol, and some amino acids. And those amino acids are from our muscle. Fat cannot be converted into carbohydrate, which is why most exercise professionals would argue their athletes should eat at least a moderate amount of carbohydrates. There's different views on what constitutes a low level of carbohydrates, but it would be in the region of less than 30 to 40% of your total calories. So we'll take a break here, and then we're going to move on and talk a bit more about fat.